The Wolfpack surfaced at night, black silhouettes against darker water diesel engines rumbling, spray breaking over the conning towers. Ahead, a convoy 20 merchant ships, maybe 30 strung out across miles of ocean. No escorts visible, no air cover. Just slow fat targets carrying food fuel ammunition. Everything Britain needed to survive. The U-boat commanders didn't need to coordinate. They'd practiced this. One boat moves in from the port side, another from starboard. A third waits ahead for ships trying to scatter. The torpedoes are already loaded. The calculations already made. This isn't war. This is a hunt. This is what German submariners called die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. The months when U-boats ruled the Atlantic, when merchant ships died by the hundreds, when Britain faced starvation, and the entire outcome of World War II hung on whether Germany could cut the supply lines before America could protect them. Summer 1940. France had fallen. The Wehrmacht stood on the Channel coast. Britain stood alone. Churchill promised defiance, but defiance required food fuel and weapons. Every single one had to come across the Atlantic. Britain produced less than half the food its population needed. Oil came from overseas. Steel, rubber, copper, ammunition, all shipped from America and the Empire. The convoys crossing the Atlantic were literally Britain's lifeline. Cut them, and the island would starve within months. Churchill understood this viscerally. He later wrote that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Not the Luftwaffe, not invasion, the submarines. Germany's U-boat force in 1940 was smaller than it should have been. Admiral Dönitz, commanding the submarine fleet, had been warning since before the war that Germany needed 300 U-boats to effectively blockade Britain. He had fewer than 60, and many were training boats, or too small for Atlantic operations. The operational strength was perhaps 30 boats, 30 submarines to patrol an entire ocean. It should have been impossible, but Dönitz understood something that surface admirals didn't. Submarines didn't need to match enemy numbers. They needed to sink ships faster than the enemy could replace them. Attrition warfare, simple mathematics. If U-boats sank more tonnage per month than British and American shipyards could build, Britain would eventually run out of ships. The Atlantic would become impassable. Britain would surrender or starve. The fall of France changed everything. Before France fell, U-boats operated from German ports on the North Sea. They had to transit around Scotland to reach the Atlantic convoy routes. Days of travel each way. Limited time on station. After France fell, Germany suddenly had access to French Atlantic ports: Brest, Lorient, La Rochelle, Saint-Nazaire, Bordeaux. Submarines operating from these bases could reach the convoy routes in hours instead of days. Time on station tripled. The strategic geography shifted entirely in Germany's favour. British convoys coming up from the South Atlantic or across from America now had to pass within easy striking distance of German submarine bases. The killing ground had moved hundreds of miles closer to the hunters. The British response was inadequate because they didn't have resources for an adequate response. The Royal Navy's destroyer force was overstretched. Every convoy needed escorts. Every invasion threat tied up ships. Every task force protecting the Mediterranean needed destroyers. There weren't enough. Convoys crossed the Atlantic with minimal protection, one or two escort vessels for dozens of merchants, sometimes none at all. The escorts they did have weren't equipped for modern submarine warfare. Astic sonar was crude. Depth charges were ineffective unless you knew exactly where the submarine was. Radar barely existed. Air cover extended only a few hundred miles from shore. The mid-Atlantic, what would come to be called the Black Gap, had no air cover at all. U-boats could operate there with impunity. The tactics Dönitz developed exploited every British weakness. U-boats would patrol on the surface at night. Surface submarines were faster than submerged could see farther and were nearly invisible in darkness. British Astic couldn't detect surface submarines. It only worked against submerged targets. So U-boats hunted on the surface, attacked on the surface, and only dove if aircraft appeared or if they needed to evade counterattack. The submarine's primary advantage wasn't stealth underwater. It was being a low-profile surface raider that could disappear beneath the waves when threatened. The Wolfpack tactic emerged during this period. One U-boat would find a convoy and report its position, course, and speed. Other boats in the area would converge. They'd wait until night, then attack simultaneously from multiple directions. The convoy escorts couldn't defend everywhere at once. While they chased one submarine, others were torpedoing merchants from different angles. The merchant ships had no defense except hope. They couldn't outrun submarines. They couldn't fight back effectively. They could only maintain course, pray they weren't targeted, and watch other ships explode around them. Being in a convoy during this period meant sitting in a slow-moving target array, waiting to see if your ship would be the next one hit. June through October 1940. These were the core months of the first happy time. U-boats sank over 270 ships, nearly 1.4 million tons. The numbers sound abstract until you understand what they meant. Each ship represented food for hundreds of thousands of people, fuel for aircraft and tanks, ammunition for guns, supplies for an army. Britain's imports dropped dramatically. Rationing tightened. Strategic reserves decreased. The mathematics of attrition were working in Germany's favour. If this rate continued, Britain couldn't survive. Churchill watched the sinking reports with growing alarm. The Navy was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. Nobody wanted to say it openly, but everyone understood it. Germany was winning the most important campaign of the war. Individual U-boat commanders became aces. Otto Kretschmer in U-99 became the most successful submarine commander of the war, sinking over 250,000 tons of shipping. His tactics were clinical move, in close fire, multiple torpedoes ensure kills. Don't waste ammunition on difficult shots. Wait for the perfect setup. Kretschmer hunted like a professional predator. Gunther Prien in U-47, already famous for penetrating Scapa Flow and sinking HMS Royal Oak in 1939, continued his success in the Atlantic. Joachim Schepke in U-100. Heinrich Lieber in U-100. These weren't anonymous submarines. German propaganda turned them into heroes. Their successes were publicized. They received medals, parades, recognition. The U-boat force gained prestige and priority. More submarines were built. More crews were trained. Dönitz's force was growing. The merchant seamen endured horror that often goes unrecognized. A torpedo hit without warning in the middle of the night. Explosion. Fire. The ship breaking apart. Water rushing in. Men trapped below decks. Others thrown into the freezing Atlantic. Oil burning on the water. Survivors clinging to wreckage. The convoy sailing on because stopping meant more ships would die. Escorts might pick up survivors if they could, but often they couldn't. They had to maintain position with the convoy. Men drowned within sight of other ships that couldn't stop to save them. The merchant marine casualty rate during the Battle of the Atlantic was higher than any military service except submarine crews themselves. These men weren't soldiers. They were civilians, sailing cargo ships, and they were dying by the thousands. The psychological impact on convoy crews was severe. You'd watch a ship next to you explode. Maybe it was carrying ammunition. The entire vessel would disintegrate in a fireball. Maybe it was fuel the ocean would ignite, creating walls of flame. Maybe it was just cargo the ship would list, break apart, and sink over agonizing minutes while you watched helplessly. Then your ship would sail past the wreckage, past the men in the water, and you'd wonder if you were next. Every night was the same dread, waiting for the explosion, listening for the submarine, knowing that somewhere in the darkness U-boats were hunting. You might survive the crossing, you might not. The odds felt increasingly bad. For the U-boat crews, the happy time was exactly that happy. Not because they enjoyed killing, though some certainly did, but because they were succeeding against minimal opposition. Targets were plentiful. Sinkings were easy. The danger was low compared to what it would become later. U-boats returned to port with victory pennants flying, displaying the tonnage they'd sunk. The crews were heroes. They got leave. They drank. They celebrated. They went back out and did it again. Dönitz rotated his boats efficiently, some on patrol, some returning, some refitting. The operational tempo was sustainable. The success rate was extraordinary. From a purely military perspective, this was what victory looked like. The British tried to adapt. Convoy sizes increased, more ships meant more targets, but also more concentrated defences. Routing was adjusted to avoid known U-boat positions, though this was guesswork since German submarines could be anywhere. New escort vessels were rushed into service, though they were often inadequately trained. Depth charge tactics improved slightly. Intelligence efforts intensified. Breaking German naval codes would become crucial later, but in 1940, the British were still largely blind to U-boat movements. Everything the British tried helped marginally, but didn't fundamentally change the equation. U-boats were sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. The technology gap favoured Germany. U-boats in 1940 were relatively modern. The Type 7 was a good design, reliable, capable, with decent range and firepower. British escorts were using doctrine and equipment from World War I. Astic was better than nothing but far from perfect. It had limited range. It couldn't detect surface targets. It was confused by thermal layers, debris, and even schools of fish. Depth charges had to explode very close to a submarine to be lethal. The chances of a random depth charge attack actually sinking a U-boat were low. Technology would eventually shift in the Allies' favour, but in 1940, the Germans had the edge. The Atlantic weather was an enemy to both sides, but particularly brutal for small ships. North Atlantic storms could scatter convoys, separate escorts, make submarine attacks impossible, but also make defense impossible. Ships sank from weather as well as torpedoes. For U-boat crews, surface patrols in heavy weather meant being thrown around inside a steel tube, constantly wet, cold, exhausted. The boats were small, barely room for the crew and equipment. Living conditions were appalling. Fresh food ran out quickly. Everything was damp. The smell was indescribable. Men developed skin conditions from the constant moisture. Psychological stress was intense, yet they kept going out because the mission mattered and the success rate justified the hardship. The strategic situation shifted slightly in late 1940. The Luftwaffe's failure in the Battle of Britain meant Germany wasn't going to invade England. The U-boat campaign became more important. If invasion was impossible, starvation was the only way to defeat Britain. Dönitz received more resources. Submarine construction accelerated. More boats entered service. The force that had started with 30 operational submarines was growing toward the 300 Dönitz had always said he needed. The Happy Times success was proving his pre-war arguments correct. Surface raiders and commerce warfare were the Kriegsmarine's path to victory, not big battleships trying to fight the Royal Navy directly. Churchill's concern about the U-boat threat became near obsession. He created the Battle of the Atlantic Committee to coordinate anti-submarine efforts. He pushed for more escort vessels. He demanded better tactics. He recognized that everything else, the Mediterranean, North Africa eventual invasion of Europe, depended on keeping the Atlantic convoy routes open. Britain could lose campaigns elsewhere and survive, lose the Atlantic, and everything else became irrelevant. The U-boats weren't just sinking ships. They were threatening Britain's ability to continue fighting. The peak of the Happy Time came in September and October 1940. U-boats were sinking over 500,000 tons per month. Convoys were being massacred. SC-7, a slow convoy from Sydney to Britain, lost 21 of its 35 ships in a single night. HX-79 lost 12 out of 49 ships. These weren't isolated incidents. This was systematic destruction. The Wolfpacks had perfected their tactics. The British hadn't yet developed effective counters. The balance was heavily tilted toward the U-boats. German submarine commanders were calling it the Happy Time because it felt too easy. They weren't fighting a desperate enemy that contested every attack. They were hunting targets that couldn't effectively fight back. The human stories from this period are almost unbearable. Merchant ships, sailing from America or Canada, knowing the statistics, knowing that roughly 1 in 4 wouldn't make it. Crews signing on anyway because the supplies had to get through and someone had to deliver them. U-boat commanders watching through periscopes as their torpedoes hit, seeing the ships break apart, sometimes hearing the explosions from miles away. Escort commanders trying to protect 40 ships with 2 vessels, making impossible choices about which direction to investigate, which submarine contact to pursue. The loneliness of command, when every decision meant lives saved or lost. The propaganda value for Germany was enormous. The U-boat successes were publicized heavily. Newsreels showed submarines returning to port tonnage tallies displayed prominently. The message was clear: Germany was winning the war at sea, Britain was being strangled, victory was inevitable. Morale in Germany remained high, partly because the U-boat campaign was delivering visible results. Citizens could see the numbers, hear about the aces, believe that Britain would soon be forced to negotiate. The propaganda wasn't lying. The U-boats really were succeeding. The threat to Britain was genuine. For Britain, the propaganda problem was managing public fear without revealing the true extent of the crisis. Sinking numbers were classified. The government couldn't admit how close Britain was to being starved into submission. But people noticed the shortages. They saw the rationing tighten. They understood that ships were being sunk. Morale held, but it was strained. The Britain can take it mentality was being tested not just by German bombs, but by the silent war in the Atlantic that most civilians never saw. The first happy time began to decline in late 1940 and early 1941 for several reasons. More escort vessels entered service. British tactics improved incrementally. Intelligence started to provide better information about U-boat locations. The Royal Navy commissioned the first escort carriers, small carriers designed specifically to provide air cover for convoys. Most importantly, more American assistance started arriving. The US wasn't in the war yet, but the Lend-Lease program meant more ships, more supplies, more capacity. The mathematics of attrition started shifting. Britain was still losing ships, but the rate was becoming survivable. The Wolfpack tactics also had limitations that became apparent over time. Coordinating multiple submarines required radio communication. Radio communication could be intercepted, and direction finding could locate the transmitter. As British signals intelligence improved, U-boat radio traffic became a liability. The boats had to surface to use radios effectively, and surfacing made them vulnerable to air attack. The tactics that worked brilliantly in 1940 would become increasingly risky as British technology and doctrine evolved. There was also the simple fact that Germany never built enough submarines. Dönitz's 300-boat target was never reached during the period when it would have mattered most. The Kriegsmarine kept building battleships and cruisers that contributed almost nothing to the war effort, instead of focusing everything on submarines. Hitler never fully understood the strategic importance of the Atlantic campaign. He was focused on land warfare, on the upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union. The U-boat force was resourced adequately, but not prioritized absolutely. That half measure would ultimately prove insufficient. The end of the first happy time is usually dated to early 1941, though the exact date is arbitrary. What's clear is that by spring 1941, the situation had stabilized. U-boats were still sinking ships, but not at the catastrophic rate of autumn 1940. The British were learning. Convoys were better protected. Air cover was expanding. Technology was improving. The mathematics of attrition were still concerning, but no longer existential. Britain would survive. The U-boats would continue to be a threat throughout the war, and there would be a second happy time in 1942 when the campaign shifted to American waters. But the moment when Germany could have won the war by submarine alone had passed. The legacy of the first happy time is complex. For Germany, it proved that the U-boat strategy could work. It validated Dönitz's approach. It showed that Britain was vulnerable, but it also revealed the limitations. Even at maximum effectiveness, even with minimal opposition, the U-boats couldn't quite sink enough shipping to actually force Britain to surrender. They came close. They made Britain desperate. But close isn't victory. The window of maximum vulnerability passed before Germany could fully exploit it. For Britain, the happy time was a near-death experience that shaped the rest of the war. The Battle of the Atlantic became the longest continuous campaign of World War II. Resources, attention, and innovation poured into anti-submarine warfare. Escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, improved radar code-breaking convoy tactics. All of these emerged partly from the desperation of 1940. Britain learned that naval supremacy meant nothing if you couldn't protect the ships carrying your supplies. Sea control wasn't about winning battles against enemy fleets. It was about keeping convoys safe. That lesson was learned in blood during the happy time. The merchant mariners who sailed during the happy time deserve recognition that's often absent from popular histories. They weren't military heroes in the traditional sense. They were civilians doing a job. But that job was crossing an ocean that was effectively a killing field. The casualty rates they suffered were horrific. The conditions were terrible. The fear was constant. They kept sailing because Britain needed them to sail, because someone had to deliver the supplies, because stopping meant starvation and defeat. Their courage was quiet and unsung, but it was absolute. Without them, Britain collapses regardless of how well the Royal Navy or RAF performed. The U-boat crews also deserve acknowledgement separate from questions of the war's morality. They were fighting a war they probably believed was justified. They were executing a military strategy that made sense from their perspective. The conditions they endured were brutal. The casualty rate among U-boat crews over the entire war would be over 75% higher than any other service in any military. In 1940, during the happy time, that future wasn't visible. They were winning. They were heroes in Germany. They were young men doing an incredibly dangerous job and succeeding at it. What happened later, the eventual defeat, the horrific losses, the realization of what their government represented was beyond their knowledge in 1940. The strategic significance of the first happy time cannot be overstated. If Germany had pressed harder, built more submarines earlier, focused everything on the Atlantic campaign, before Britain could adapt, the outcome might have been different. Britain in 1940s to 41 was hanging on by its fingernails. The margin between survival and collapse was thin. More U-boats, more aggressive tactics, sustained pressure for a few more months. Britain might have reached a breaking point where continuing the war became impossible. That didn't happen, but it was closer than most people realize. The happy time also demonstrated something about warfare that remains true. Strategic choke points matter more than spectacular battles. The U-boats weren't winning dramatic victories. They were sinking cargo ships. Unglamorous, methodical, economically devastating. Germany never quite understood that this, not invasions, not tank battles, not air superiority, was their path to victory in 1940. The leadership kept getting distracted by more traditional military operations. The U-boat campaign was resourced and supported, but never with the single-minded focus it deserved. That was Britain's great fortune. The technological and tactical innovations that would eventually defeat the U-boats were all seeded during the first happy time. Radar would improve until submarines couldn't safely surface at night. Long-range aircraft would close the black gap in the mid-Atlantic. Code-breaking would reveal U-boat positions. Escort carriers would provide air cover. Hunter-killer groups would actively seek out submarines rather than just defending convoys. Better depth charges would make attacks more lethal. All of these developments came from recognizing what worked during the happy time and desperately trying to counter it. Germany had a window when they had the advantage. That window closed because Britain adapted faster than Germany could press their advantage. The first happy time ended not with a decisive battle, but with gradual shifts in capability and context. More escorts, better tactics, improved technology, American entry into the war changing strategic calculations. The U-boats didn't suddenly become ineffective. They just stopped being overwhelmingly dominant. The balance shifted from Britain might not survive to Britain will probably survive if they keep adapting. That shift was gradual, unmemorable, and decisive. The months of the happy time, June to November 1940, represented the closest Germany came to winning World War II through non-military means, not through invasion, not through defeating Britain's military, but through economics and logistics, by cutting supply lines, by making the ocean too dangerous to cross, by threatening starvation. Britain stood alone in 1940, defiant but desperate. The U-boats nearly turned defiance into irrelevance. Nearly, but not quite. The happy time proved that Germany had a viable path to victory. It also proved that Germany couldn't or wouldn't follow that path with sufficient commitment to actually achieve victory. Looking back from 80 years later, the first happy time feels like a footnote in the larger war. It gets overshadowed by more dramatic events, the Battle of Britain, Pearl Harbor, Stalingrad, D-Day. But in 1940, this was the main event. This was where the war was being decided. German submarines hunting British convoys in the dark Atlantic wasn't cinematic or dramatic. It was methodical, economic, strategic. It was warfare at its most fundamental level, cutting the enemy's supply lines. The Wolfpack surfacing at night, lining up torpedo shots, sinking merchant ships, carrying food and fuel. That was Germany's best chance to win. They came agonizingly close. The ships burned, the convoys bled, Britain trembled, and then gradually the tide began to turn. The happy time ended. The long, grinding battle of the Atlantic would continue for years. But the moment when U-boats could have won the war slipped away. Germany would keep fighting. The submarines would keep hunting. But they'd never again be as close to victory as they were during those dark months of 1940 when the Wolfpacks ruled the Atlantic, and Britain's survival was measured in tonnage, sunk versus tonnage built. The first happy time was Germany's best chance. And it wasn't quite enough.